So before we get into actually finding our confidence intervals, again, there's one more thing that we really need to define and discuss before we go through that process, and that is our T-distribution and our T-statistic. So in this case, the hypothesis test and confidence intervals for estimating and testing the mean are based on a statistic called the T-statistic. It is similar to a Z-statistic, right? So it's similar to our Z-scores, but it's not exactly the same. Since the population standard deviation is almost always unknown, we're going to divide by an estimate of the standard error using our sample standard deviation. The big difference between our T-statistic is it's more variable than our Z-statistic. So what that means is our T-statistic denominator changes based on our sample standard deviation. The T-statistic does not follow the normal distribution, so it changes a little bit. There's a little bit more variation when we're using our T-distribution. So we're still going to check our conditions and things like that, but just remember our T-distribution is slightly different than our Z-distribution that we've been talking about. The T-distribution is symmetric and unimodal. It is bell-shaped like the normal curve. The differences here is we have thicker tails, so that's one of the differences of our T-distribution. The shape depends on something called the degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom are related to the sample size. When we're estimating a single mean and we're dealing with our degrees of freedom, we take n minus 1. So our sample size minus 1 gives us our degrees of freedom. If our degrees of freedom is small, the tails are thick. As our degrees of freedom increases, tails get thinner. So if we look at what we have here, we see that based on our sample size, which impacts our degrees of freedom, we start with thicker tails, and then the larger our sample size gets, the closer and closer we get to a normal distribution. Again, if we were working through and going through these by hand, we would be using our degrees of freedom. Instead of using a Z table like we did in previous chapters, we would actually be using a T table to look up our T-star value to find our margin of error. Again, we're just going to kind of bypass that part this semester and focus on StatCrunch more.